Welcome to Pax Britannica. Season 3, Episode 43, Between Darkness and Light. Welcome back to Pax Britannica. I'm your host, Dr. Samuel Hume. Before we begin, I'd like to welcome the new members of the Patreon House of Lords. The newly appointed Duke of Russell, Xander Russell, and Joseph Earl Beckerman. If you'd like to join their ranks and not only listen to the podcast ad-free, but help support the show, then go to patreon.com/PaxBritannica. Thank you to all of my patrons. Last time, we saw the rule of the Major Generals, the Protectorate's attempt to both clamp down on Royalist rebellion and encourage a moral reformation of England and Wales. A new system of military governors was established across the two nations, and each Major General was given the support of several commissioners. To encourage a moral reformation, these new authorities clamped down on sin, enforcing laws against games, drinking, and high church extravagance. To guard against another rebellion, new militias were formed, answering to the Major Generals and funded by an extra parliamentary tax on known Royalists, the decimation tax. But by the summer of 1656, it was becoming increasingly clear that the Protectorate's finances were in freefall. The decimation tax, despite all the ill will it stirred up, was not bringing in much money, and the new system was expensive. The Western design was still sucking up money and blood in the guerrilla war in Jamaica, and now war with Spain was hurting Commonwealth trade. And so, despite Lord Protector Cromwell's misgivings, a new Parliament was called and elections arranged. The plan was for Parliament to approve all these changes and arrange for a tax to put the Treasury back on firm footing. The regime really wanted this election to go right. And as the old saying goes, if you fail to prepare, you prepare to fail, and so they prepared. Known critics of the government, especially notable Republicans and Commonwealth's men, were suppressed. Sir Henry Vane had published a critical pamphlet in May 1656. He was summoned to the Council of State and ordered to provide a bond for good behaviour of £5,000. Vane refused. This was no better than the arbitrary rule of the Stuarts, he said. So he was packed off to the Isle of Wight to get him out of the way. Remember John Bradshaw, the midwife of the Republic, who had sentenced a king to death? Well, he was fired from his position as Chief Justice of Chester and forced into retirement. Edmund Ludlow, former comrade of Cromwell and now determined critic, confronted his old friend in person. The Lord Protector asked him, "What can you desire more than you have?" Ludlow responded, "That which we have fought for, that the nation might be governed by its own consent." Ludlow was ordered to give a bond for good behaviour, also £5,000, though Cromwell allowed it to go unpaid, as long as he stayed quiet in Essex. With the ground suitably prepared, a new Parliament was called in July, with elections in August. The Major Generals and their commissioners, along with their allied Godley, took to their election campaigns with zeal. This was the chance to solidify the moral reformation, to place the rule of the Major Generals on permanent footing, and to make England, and Wales, a nation of the elect. But government supporters were not the only people treating this election as a referendum on godly rule. The campaign saw strange alliances. Even in Puritan strongholds like the southeast, Royalists and Presbyterians campaigned together. Known Royalists couldn't vote themselves, but they still had resources and reputations which could be useful in an election. Many candidates were elected to Parliament on the open platform of opposing the rule of the Major Generals. Resentment of the new system came from many angles. Old Conservatives hated the new system. Not only were the Major Generals seen to supplant traditional power structures, but the Major Generals and their commissioners were seen as up-jumped nobodies. As we saw last time, this wasn't strictly accurate for most of them, but the reputation stuck, and it was made worse by the fact that their rule was blatantly backed up by force, not like the traditional power structures, which were only implicitly backed up by force. Of course, as we also saw last time, many of the major generals worked with existing power structures, and so the true extent of their meddling in local affairs was limited. The number of people who actually faced the decimation tax was a fraction of those targeted, and the reforming zeal of the new system was limited by practical reality. But in politics, perception is everything, and the rule of the major generals was perceived to be suffocating, petty, revolutionary, and backed up by the sword. As the election approached, the former confidence of the major generals that government supporters would obviously be swept into Parliament by a grateful electorate began to wane and be replaced by more cautious concern. When the elections took place, all but one of the major generals was elected to Parliament. George Fleetwood was the sole exception. But these high-profile successes were only part of the story. This Parliament would not be a landslide in support for the Protectorate that the major generals had promised. In fact, of the 400 MPs elected to Parliament across the whole Commonwealth, the major generals drew up a list of MPs they recommended be barred from sitting. In the end, the Lord Protector approved a list of 112 members of Parliament who would not be allowed to sit. When this Parliament met on the 17th of September, it was clear that this was by far the most militarised cohort of MPs that Parliament had seen since the Civil Wars. Alongside the major generals, many army officers had won seats too. But the majority of MPs, even those who had escaped an initial purge, were deeply critical of the rule of the major generals. Cromwell opened his third Parliament and his second one as Protector with a long and rambling speech in the Painted Chamber. He publicly praised the major generals and dismissed criticisms of the decimation tax, and denounced anyone who opposed either as enemies of England. He justified both the Western design and the war with Spain by referring to Elizabethan tropes, and mixed it all together with a dislike of Catholicism. Then, the MPs left the Painted Chamber and made their way to the House of Commons, at which point they saw a force of soldiers waiting for them. The colonels there invoked 3 articles of the Instrument of Government, Article 14 and 15, which forbade Royalists and Catholics from sitting, both of which had been invoked for the First Protectorate Parliament. But now they also invoked Article 17, which excluded anyone who wasn't of, quote, known integrity, fearing God, and of good conversation. If that sounds vague, it was by design. Under this article, the government could pick and choose who was excluded. That list of 112 MPs was now used, and anyone on that list was barred from entering and taking their seats. This, naturally, outraged many of the other MPs, and another 60 or so refused to take their places in solidarity. More than a quarter of the members, and maybe up to a third, of the Second Protectorate Parliament had been purged before it even met. It was obvious to anyone paying attention that these purged MPs had not been barred because they were Royalists or Catholics. They'd been blocked much earlier in the election process. Most of them weren't even critics of the Protectorate and were no threat to the stability of the government. They'd been barred because they opposed the rule of the major generals. What makes this even more complex was that one of those deeply critical of the major generals was the Lord Protector. Now in public he backed them, as he had just done in his speech, but he was scathing towards them in public. Not only had the system failed to raise enough money to cover their costs, but they had promised a supportive parliament, and in that they had failed. Cromwell himself had opposed excluding so many MPs. Besides any sincere sentiments for Parliament, he understood that this looked very bad. But he was at least promised that, this unfortunate business aside, the Second Protectorate Parliament would be docile. And that was what he would get, more or less. There was a petition from 79 of the excluded MPs which was debated for a few days, but government ministers justified their actions under the instrument, and criticism of the purge died down. In that first session of the Parliament, things seemed to go pretty well. 71 acts were passed and presented to Cromwell for his assent, That beat the First Protectorate Parliament's record of, let me see, where's my notes? 0. And most of these were about the moral reformation, which Cromwell was happy to praise. Others took a look at questions of the regime's legitimacy. One act annulled any claim which Charles Stuart, the so-called King of Great Britain, held over the Commonwealth, and made it an act of high treason to give him fealty or support. Also, remember when I mentioned that the treason charges for Penruddock had caused a bit of controversy? This was now put to bed. Not only was the definition of treason expanded to fit the new political reality, but a new body of commissioners, not judges, was established with the power to convict and sentence people for trying to kill the Protector. But this honeymoon period couldn't last forever, and it didn't take long for Parliament to veer into a familiar and rocky subject: the question of toleration, and the extent of the government's tolerance for religious radicals came under great attention when a man entered the city of Bristol. What made this such a noteworthy entrance? Well, it was who that man was and how he entered the city. The man in question was James Naylor, a well-known Quaker. If you recall the Quakers, they were a very controversial offshoot of Protestantism, which would one day gain a positive reputation for pacifism. They didn't have that yet, and instead in these early years their reputation was for violently interrupting sermons they didn't agree with and encouraging radical ideas like the equality of the sexes and stressing the personal connection between a Christian and God. The founder of the movement, George Fox, had met with the Lord Protector in 1654, and they got on fairly well. But in 1656, a brewing conflict within the movement came to a head. Part power struggle, part theological divide, Naylor had his own followers who were increasingly calling him the reborn Messiah. This, unsurprisingly, got him into trouble with the law, and he'd been imprisoned in Exeter. But after lobbying Major General Desborough, Naylor was released in October 1656. 4 days after his release, he rode into Bristol. And how? He was on a horse, his long hair untied, his beard forked, and his followers led the way, holding the horse's bridle, scattering cloves in front of his mount, and singing psalms. This was the entry of Jesus into Jerusalem on Palm Sunday, and the Bristol authorities were fuming. Not just at the blasphemy itself. Naylor claimed he was not Jesus, but merely a vessel for Jesus. But the danger it posed. Spectacles like this were effective marketing for Quakers. Naylor and his followers were arrested, but the magistrates decided that this was way above their pay grade, and so they sent the group on to London, where Parliament was currently sitting. A committee, 55 members strong, debated these charges for a month, before bringing their conclusions to the full House in December. For 10 days, the MPs debated not just Naylor's actions and what they meant, but where the line of toleration would be drawn. The 1650 blasphemy law had a maximum punishment of 6 months' imprisonment. Some MPs thought this strict reading of the law would be fine. Others came to the opposite conclusion. One of the major generals called for Naylor to be stoned to death. Naylor would escape a death sentence by a narrow 14-vote difference. Instead, he was whipped from the Strand to the City of London. Then he was branded on the forehead with a B for blasphemer, and then he was sent back to Bristol, where he repeated his blasphemous entry, but this time sitting backwards in shame. After all this, he was brought back to London and dumped in Bridewell Prison, where he would sit for 3 years. Cromwell had stayed out of the debates, even though he favoured toleration, and disliked the venom he was hearing from many of the more zealous MPs, not to mention the brutal punishment of Naylor. But he limited himself to stating his doubt over Naylor's treatment. He didn't interfere, although it is possible that Naylor escaped execution because some MPs suspected Cromwell would veto it. But he was reminded of how finely balanced his vision of a tolerant Commonwealth was. With Naylor's case settled in the week before Christmas, many MPs meandered away from the House, even though the holiday was officially banned, and the 25th of December was meant to be any other day. because it was meant to be any other day, the House of Commons was sitting and discussing that most important of subjects, tree law. For some reason which I just cannot divine, the House was relatively empty on this day. The MPs sitting that day included the most fervent Puritans and the most dedicated government supporters, and maybe a couple of tree lawyers. And it was this crowd which Major General Desborough stood up to address. He wasn't going to wax lyrical about the forests. He had a different topic in mind. Desborough presented the Militia Bill. He proposed a new act which would make the decimation tax permanent and give it parliamentary sanction, all to support the militia. For a topic so central to government policy, it's remarkable how quiet everyone, critic and supporter, had been about the decimation tax for the last 3 months Parliament had sat. No one wanted to kick that wasp nest. Until now. With government supporters on the benches and their critics thinly presented, the Act passed its first reading. A second reading would take place the following day. By now, word had spread and opponents were flocking back to the House, but it still passed, by a narrower margin than might have been expected. A third reading was arranged to fall on the 7th of January 1657. By this point, the Christmas that wasn't Christmas was well in the rear view, and the House was nearly full. Many opponents of the Militia Bill sat on the benches that day, and the debate was fierce. For starters, the bill would overrule the Act of Oblivion and threaten the rule of law. The idea of parliamentary sovereignty, that Parliament could make or unmake any law, was far from set in stone, especially in these uncertain times. Not only would it violate an existing law, but it would surely go a long way towards undoing the healing and settling of the nation, opening old wounds to rummage inside for coins. And of course, opposition tapped into the very present resentment of the system of major generals. Penruddock's rising had been alarming, but had also shown how ineffective royalist conspiracy was. Why exactly did England and Wales need this extensive and expensive form of military rule? All politics is local, and in the elections of this Parliament, many electors had been more concerned about the militarization of their communities than an unlikely rebellion. Throw in the unpopularity of the more zealous advocates of the moral reformation, and you have a powerful bloc of opposition. The debate was marked by the intervention of one John Claypole. Claypole was none other than the Lord Protector's son-in-law, and whatever he said was surely not far from Cromwell's own mind. Claypole warned against the Militia Bill because it was against the healing and settling of the nation. His words gave full license to anyone looking for guidance from the court of the Protector. Cromwell was against the major generals. Further reinforcements for the critics came from an old friend of the show, Lord Brokehill. Brokehill had been very busy over the last few years in all 3 former kingdoms. He worked hard to make the Protectorate work, building bridges and pushing up against vested interests in both Ireland and Scotland to try and bring about a more perfect union. More than one historian has called him the first British politician for this. He stood up in the House of Commons, arguing against the Militia Bill, saying that to pass it would make the Protectorate as wicked as the Royalists. But the major generals were not letting these attacks go unanswered. Desborough, who had brought the bill forward, was unrepentant. He thought the bill could be much harsher, and it would be if he'd had his way. John Lambert, one of the system's main architects, fought hard to protect his baby. Quote, "The quarrel is now between light and darkness, not who shall rule, but whether we shall live or be preserved, or no." The debate was paused at the end of the day on the 7th of January, and it was put to one side for nearly 2 weeks. And then news broke which changed everything. On the 19th of January 1657, the evening before the debate was due to reopen, John Thurlow, Cromwell's Secretary of State and his spymaster, stood to address the assembly. Someone had tried to kill the Protector. This latest plot had brought together enemies of the government both foreign and domestic. The plot became known as the Syndicum Plot, courtesy of one of its leaders, Miles Syndicum. Syndicum had worked with Edward Sexby, who we last saw all the way back in episode 263, when he took a leading role in the Putney debates. In the years since, he'd been a fervent Republican, working with the government in various roles up until the dissolution of the Rump in 1653. From here, Sexby parted ways with his former commander-in-chief, leaving the Commonwealth and falling in with a bad crowd. That bad crowd was, of course, the exiled Stuart court. This was a strange alliance. The leveller Sexby hated monarchy, but he now hated Cromwell more. He seems to have believed that a restored Stuart monarchy would either guarantee the rights of Englishmen, or else inspire another revolution which would restore the Republic. The details of how this would work out weren't exactly clear to him, but one thing he did know: Cromwell must die. The Royalist court and the King of Spain were happy to give him what funds and equipment they could spare. He returned to the Commonwealth in the summer of 1656, where he met up with Miles Syndicum. Syndicum was another former agitator from the New Model Army days, and he was no stranger to plots. He'd been part of the earlier Overton plot, although he'd escaped the fallout of its immediate collapse. They began to form their own plot, recruiting other radicals and putting together a plan. Sexby brought guns and money. Syndicum brought resolve. He was prepared to die in the attempt, so long as he took Cromwell with him. Their first plan didn't get off the ground. They aimed to strike at the Lord Protector as his coach rode to the opening of Parliament in September. On the day, Syndicum entered a house rented for the occasion and which had a view of the street, and he brought with him a viola case filled with pistols and an arquebus. But though Syndicum thought he was willing to die, he took one look at the packed street, all those spectators, all those soldiers, and he lost his nerve. But there was no harm done. This plot had failed without the Protectorate ever realising they were there, partly because they hadn't actually done anything. Their second plan was to target the Lord Protector during one of his many rides. Even in his increasingly poor health, Cromwell loved to ride, and he visited Hyde Park daily. Syndicum watched from the outskirts of the park as one of his fellow plotters, John Cecil, a former soldier, joined the many horsemen trotting around. Opportunity struck when Cecil was approached by none other than his target, the Lord Protector. Cromwell wanted to chat about horses, and so he was only a few yards away. Syndicum must have been holding his breath. All that Cecil had to do was draw his pistol and fire. But Cecil panicked. Whether he felt that Cromwell had somehow worked out his intentions, or maybe the simple reminder that the man he had come to the park to kill was, in fact, a person who came to shoot the breeze about horses, whatever it was, he made his excuses and galloped away. Cromwell probably thought that odd, or maybe a bit rude, but others around him were more suspicious. Thurlow was soon informed about the strange event, and it didn't take long for the plotters to be identified. Syndicum and the others were, of course, unaware of this, and they prepared their third attempt on the Lord Protector's life. This time, they would draw from history. A new gunpowder plot was hatched. On the 8th of January, the day after that heated debate about the Militia Bill, the assassins sawed their way through a back door of the Palace of Whitehall, and placed within the chapel a barrel of tar, pitch, and gunpowder. Cromwell's apartments were above, and when the bomb was ignited, the Lord Protector, and most of Whitehall, would go up in smoke. But Thurlow was watching. One of the conspirators had wavered and betrayed the group. After the plotters left, agents went in and disarmed the bomb, and the plotters were rounded up. Syndicum was questioned personally by Cromwell, much like James had interrogated Guy Fawkes, but he gave nothing away. He didn't need to, because Cecil sang like a canary. Thurlow recounted all of this to Parliament on the 19th, and laid out the unholy combination of Spanish Catholics, English Royalists, and Levellers. The response from Parliament was support for the regime. MPs voted Thurlow the thanks of the House for his work in defeating the conspiracy, but it also focused their minds. The plot had been foiled, but what if it hadn't been? It had not been the first plot, after all, and surely would not be the last. and even if the Lord Protector dodged bullet, bomb, and blade, Cromwell's health had been poor for a while. What if a bad cold carried him off? What happens to a protectorate without its Lord Protector? Of course, the instrument of government provided for this. The Council of State would elect the Protector's successor, but only after the Protector died. This would leave the state leaderless for as long as it took the Council to decide, and many suspected, probably rightly, that the Council of State would pick the candidate with the most support within the army, most likely John Lambert. The Commonwealth would still be governed by the sword. The Major Generals thought that was great. Their critics, not so much. They favoured a system which could draw on centuries of precedent, but refined with the liberties won in the Revolution and the Civil Wars. So next time, we will see Parliament address the succession, and consider the proclamation of King Oliver I. Thank you to my House of Lords, including the King's favourite Mike Sanders, Damien, Duke of Portland, Steve Cloutier, Marquis of Hull, and Jesse Hullsizer of the Earldom of Rockingham. Go to patreon.com/Pax Britannica to join their ranks and listen to the podcast without ads. The other best way to support the show is to share it with a friend. Go on, send them a link as you pick something to listen to next. For other great podcasts on the Airwave Network, check out airwavemedia.com, and thank you to Sounds Like an Earful for the interval music in today's episode, to my entire House of Lords, and to you for listening.